Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our tropical weather outlook video for today, July 27th, 2024. Today we have an area of interest that we mentioned yesterday to watch for in the Atlantic as we head into early August. It is now tagged by the National Hurricane Center as a potential area of interest to watch officially, so we have that. And also, we'll take a look at activity elsewhere, including the Eastern Pacific, because there is areas of interest there too. Things starting to get active, and it makes sense as we're closing out the month of July and heading into August when things tend to get more active in this part of the world. So let's get started with the National Hurricane Center homepage. Obviously, we have an area of interest in the Atlantic, and it has a 30% chance over the next week to potentially develop. And I'm pretty sure as time goes on, that chance will probably increase, and you could see where the area of development is especially as it gets towards the Western Atlantic, and that poses a particular interest because the Western Atlantic is where we live. So this will be definitely something to watch. They mention especially the Lesser Antilles during the early to middle part of next week, and then as it generally moves west northwestward near or over the greater Antilles towards the latter part of next week. So this will definitely be something that we have to watch over the next week or so, and it could potentially try to get its act together, or at least that's what some of the global models have. As this heads into the Western Atlantic, that's when conditions might generally become more favorable. In the meantime, in the Eastern Pacific, there's also other areas of interest to watch. It looks like the Eastern Pacific is slowly starting to, gain some heat, especially after for a while of being completely lifeless, especially compared to what we usually see in the Eastern Pacific. They're finally starting to gain some action in area of interest. First off the southern east southwestern Mexican coastline, and it looks like this area has the highest chance of both. It's a medium chance. That'll looks like whatever does form or whatever does happen will probably parallel off the southwestern Mexican coast. So I guess those in Mexico should watch this area closely. And then there's another area in the Pacific that has a 30% chance, and this will probably stay well out to sea, away from any interest. But there's generally things beginning to pick up. And we'll also have to watch the Eastern Pacific as well. Right now, though, in both basins, not much happening. You can see there's some convective activity throughout the Caribbean, extending into the Eastern Pacific and even extending into the Atlantic, though. But this is probably all associated with the ITCZ. There's also some frontal action going on off the East Coast. This will actually be something to watch because some people are mentioning some low pressure system could form early next week. So this might be something we could watch. Some of the models have it. But in general, especially if you're in the East and especially the Northeast, this is bringing exceptionally nice weather conditions, especially for late July. I know, especially for me here in New York City, at least yesterday was a really beautiful day, especially for the standards we typically get in late July. And that is as a result of this front kind of coming off the coasts. So that is bringing nice weather there. And then we also have throughout the south and the southeast, especially along the Gulf Coast, seems like there is some convective activity, probably some thunderstorms beginning to blow up there as well. While out in the eastern Atlantic, we obviously see there is some convective activity there. It's going to be from one of these areas where there's a tropical wave that is what's sparking interest for potential development in the Atlantic. I think it's this area right here, this sort of piece of energy here. It's kind of all stretched out and embedded within this ITCZ, as I said. But looks like as we head towards the week into early next week, we're going to have to watch that some piece of energy could break off from this ITCZ and then move westward, and then that'll potentially kind of lie our eyes on the Western Atlantic. But for now, activity is kind of convective, or at least convective activity is kind of anemic. You could also see that there's definitely lots of dry air to the north, which will be something that kind of is an influence on how much this will develop. But it's also because of, and I found an interesting tweet that kind of breaks it down from Andrew Austin Adler. Kind of read it as Justin for a second, but it's Austin. And he mentions that our tropical wave of interest appears quite anemic this morning, likely due to the proximity to dry air and subsidence associated with an active convectively coupled Kelvin wave passage. And he does say that it should be noted that this same convectively coupled Kelvin wave passage will eventually help aid in development later down the road through amplified convergence at the surface and modulation of the tropical atmosphere, enhanced moisture and instability, supporting an increase in convection. And he does say that it is worth mentioning that the two areas of vorticity exist within the greater monsoon trough. These features are expected to coalesce, and their interaction with favorable forcing should be the last piece of the puzzle for tropical development. And that's basically the general synopsis of this area in the Atlantic. And when he's talking about a convectively coupled Kelvin wave, I think he's talking about, this area right here, or is it this convectively coupled Kelvin wave through here? But there's generally supposed to be some sort of convectively coupled Kelvin wave. And if you're not familiar with what that term is, it basically, think of it as fertilizer, that once, a truck with fertilizer comes through, the ground is fertile, and in this case, the atmosphere is fertile for tropical development, and that's what these Kelvin waves kind of are, and that's what these Kelvin waves kind of act for, in terms of helping promote tropical development anywhere, but especially when we're talking about it in this circumstance. This is what's going to be helping to aid and kind of lay the groundwork for whatever development does try to occur in the Atlantic next week. But as he does mention, there is that which will help it. But in the near future, right now, there is the component of dry air, especially from Saharan air. And you can see that very well, very strongly throughout the northern MDR. Lots of dusty air coming off the continent of Africa, typical of this time of year. It's not till next month where we truly start to see this retreat further north and leave the MDR a lot more open for development, because waves would be a lot less prone to this dry air. But it is starting to recede a little bit, but it's still there. And for right now, at least, that's going to kind of impede on whatever does happen in the tropical Atlantic, which is why, and you can especially see as we get towards the Western Atlantic, the Saharan air, that kind of dusty air that we have, does reduce, and therefore the atmosphere would probably be more favorable. So there's that part of the puzzle. And then there's the sea surface temperatures, on the other hand, which no matter what this year is just very favorable, because we have very warm sea surface temperatures across the MDR, really the entire deep tropics in the Atlantic, but through the MDR into the Caribbean and especially into the general Western Atlantic air, we're looking at areas at least solidly of 0.5, even a full degree Celsius on average above the normal. And that means lots of extra added heat to the ocean, and that would be lots of extra energy for these tropical waves to work with and help them blossom and grow into tropical systems. And how does that how do we look at this in terms of actual sea surface temperatures, at least from the Western MDR, and you could generally see, especially as it heads further west into the Atlantic, we go from a bunch of these 28 degrees Celsius to even 29s. So we're looking at mid to upper 80s in Fahrenheit. And in terms of oceanic conditions, that is definitely a lot, and more than warm enough for potential development of a tropical system. So we have that worked, and we have that kind of laid out. It's just a matter of how things evolve with this wave, and it's all going to evolve over the next week. So let's take a look at a model, starting off with the European, to see how this kind of evolves, because there's quite a bit of uncertainty right now. Some global models are trying to develop this area of interest, some aren't. There's also another factor of land too, because that area of interest by the National Hurricane Center, that kind of hatched area, let's actually really quickly go back to it. We are talking about the islands, which could be potentially an area we watch for impacts in general, not just to see whether or not this develops, but general impacts with this, because it will be a tropical wave and it will bring heavy rain and gusty winds regardless of whether or not this becomes a tropical system. But you can also see that the greater Antilles, so Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Cuba, those areas will also get impacts from this wave, tropical system, or whatever it is as well. And so that'll be something that also is something to watch, but also kind of is interesting in terms of how it'll actually impact the development itself of the system. And you'll see on the European, at least by the 12Z European, with what they do, you can kind of see the wave here. It's kind of energy that originates from the central Western MDR, consolidates over the next few days by hour 120. You could see solid piece of energy north of the islands. You could definitely tell though it'll probably be enough energy that we see gusty winds and heavy rains to the northern parts of the Greater Antilles. And then as we head towards the next 6 to 7 days, moves over the Bahamas, you can see there's definitely some sort of solid signal. And then as we move it out into the next 7 to 10 days, the European, or as I should say, King Euro, is the most solid model. It seems like of all the global models right now, they take this and develop this into a pretty formidable hurricane as it moves over the Gulf Stream. And I guess that does kind of pose as a potential watch threat, not necessarily an actual real threat, but a potential area to watch or something to watch for the Southeast maybe through next week into the first general several days of August. But that's the European, and they kind of have it as a more northerly solution, and they keep this north of the Antilles Islands. But this is once again out to day 10, so a little uncertainty, especially with the strong part that the European does indicate. Other models like the GFS, on the other hand, you can actually really quickly see it at hour 240. There's nothing. The European we go from the EC Fast, or the European. It's the European model, but it just loads the full run faster. We go from a formidable hurricane on the European to the GFS 12Z, where there's absolutely nothing. And you can see if we take it out through the next several days, you see the reflection of the wave, but notice how that piece of energy, if you're able to track it, it just kind of rides the islands, and I guess it suppresses itself into the Greater Antilles. And obviously with the component of land interaction, it's not really able to develop into much of anything formidable at all. So in this case, we have the European, which develops it, but the GFS doesn't. And then I think there's the CMC as well, which is another model that's been picking up on this lately. And I guess they kind of show both scenarios from the GFS and the Euro, where they kind of show it go through the Greater Antilles, but then it kind of maybe goes south enough that it's in the Northern Caribbean, and it uses the kind of ocean real estate in the Northern Caribbean, and it develops and becomes a hurricane in the Gulf out to 10 days. But the key is, especially with the Canadian model, we're looking at 9 to 10 days when this is in the Gulf. And trust me, do not get overworked about anything that happens from this area, especially in terms of it becoming a formidable hurricane or anything like that at all, especially because whatever we're seeing right now in the model is 10 days out. There's a lot of uncertainty, and I'm showing all of these models the way I am to kind of just hammer down the point that there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of things to watch when it comes to how this system develops, and I'm just showing you the different models to see what the different possibilities are. And I think that's really the only thing you could do when we're still talking about potentially what will become of this system is still 9 to 10 days out in the Western Atlantic. So we have those three areas to watch. But I want to take this back to the GFS because I want to show the relative humidity. And this is the biggest point at the end of the day, is that regardless of whether or not this will develop, you could clearly see, especially with the tropical wave, it's right in here. And notice over the next week, as this tropical wave or tropical system of whatever, whatever entity it is, it will pass near the islands, and you can see the relative humidity as it moves through the islands. It'll definitely have energy with it, enough so that it'll bring gusty winds, heavy rains, and all that kind of, whatever. And that is enough to cause an inconvenience, even though the system is not a full-blown hurricane or tropical storm. So that is something to take note of, and that's something I definitely want to write home about, and I will continue to till I die, because that is probably the most significant thing you need to know when it comes to tracking hurricanes. Doesn't matter how strong or weak they are. Even if it's just a weak storm, gusty winds and heavy rains, no matter what, will still cause an inconvenience, even if we don't have blasting 100-mile-per-hour winds from it being a solid hurricane. So that is everything that we're watching in the Atlantic right now. And really quickly before we close out, why not take a look at the Eastern Pacific? Because regardless of what happens in the Atlantic, it does look like the Eastern Pacific, on the other hand, things could get active. I just showed you 2 areas of interest in the Eastern Pacific. The GFS spins them up. Looks like we can see both of those areas here. I guess this is the 30% chance one, and then this is the 50% chance one on the GFS. Looks like the 50% fit that area near Mexico, or I'm going to call it the area that's closer to Mexico. Looks like the GFS spins that into a pretty formidable hurricane. About time for the Eastern Pacific, especially given how little activity they've had over the last several weeks. Not saying that, they should get it, but, eventually when you don't have something that typically happens as part of nature, it kind of builds up to the point where it just comes out all at once. And I guess that's maybe what the GFS is hinting at. And then you can see even out through the next 7 to 10 days on the GFS, they're spinning out hurricane after hurricane after hurricane. Especially this other storm that the GFS shows, maybe that'll be another area of interest down the line. Becomes a pretty formidable system. You get it. The bottom line is that the Eastern Pacific will start to become more active. Let's actually really quickly go back to the map that I saw from this tweet by this guy, Andrew Austin Adler. He mentions the convectively coupled Kelvin wave. You could see that it is moving through into the Atlantic, but of course, first off, it does move through the Eastern Pacific. And usually the way it works is that whenever we have these MJO, convectively coupled Kelvin wave passages, they tend to pass through the Pacific first, and as a result, things get favorable in the Pacific. The Pacific probably ends up going off in activity for at least 2 or 3 weeks, and then eventually those conditions shift to the Atlantic, and things become more favorable there. And that's probably what's going to happen over the next several weeks. Things will become more favorable in the Pacific for a while, but then especially as we head towards mid-month next month, things will become more favorable in the Atlantic, and that'll also kind of make sense as it will begin to coincide with when we start to have the ramp-up climatology towards the peak season of the Atlantic hurricane season. Nice how everything kind of lines up, does it? With that being said, though, not much else to go over. We're obviously going to be watching this area of interest very closely in the Atlantic. We'll see what it does as it gets towards the Western Atlantic and towards the islands, especially into next week. And of course, we'll watch the Eastern Pacific as well, since it looks like it'll begin to heat up soon as we close out the month. With that being said, really hope you enjoyed today's video. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and hopefully a blessed one as well. Stay safe. Peace, love, and kindness to you all. We will talk again tomorrow.